Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. I got a question for you. Are you into the end of the world? Is the end of the world a little kinky for you? Does it get you all excited? Does it get you going? I mean, I think it is very, very clear that people today love the end of the world. It's like you go to the science fiction and fantasy section, and it's hard to find a new book that is not somehow about the end of the world. People love their apocalypses, zombie and otherwise. They just eat that shit up all day. Hoover it up. I think I used to be like that. I think I used to be dystopian, but I'm not anymore. I don't know why. I don't know what changed. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like I'm a utopian, for Christ's sake. I mean, my God, can you imagine that? No way. No, it's just that the future bores the shit out of me. Utopian, dystopian, y'all are full of it. All y'all. No, I am into the power of now. The power of now. That's an Eckhart Tolle joke there, right there for you. Bet you didn't think you were going to get that in one of those good old Peoples and Things episode, now did you? But how about the history and sociology of visions and ideas about the end of the world? Hold on a second. Now that's kind of interesting. You might be able to get a lot of mileage out of that little inquiry there. And brothers and sisters of the P&T, I am bringing you what I believe is one of the great historians of the end of the world. His name is Zachary Loeb. He's an assistant professor of history at Purdue University, a proud engineering school, that place. Loeb describes himself on his faculty page thusly: my research focuses on the end of the world. More specifically, I am interested in the belief that humanity's romance with technology has the species and the planet set on a course that will inevitably lead to catastrophe. End quote. Whew! Dazam, folks. Dazam. Zachary and I had a fun time together. For my part, I would call it a blast. We talk about some big old themes in the beginning, and then eventually we turn to talking about his dissertation and forthcoming book, A Very Interesting History of Y2K, which I know so many of you love. I know that right now, the very mention of Y2K, your pulse just picked up a little bit. Got the sweats coming on a little bit. This conversation, it's like a bomb that ends the world. Hey, get excited. Zachary, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Lee. It's great to be on the podcast.
So I wanted to begin by talking to you about the end of the world. The bio on your Purdue faculty page begins with these two sentences. Zachary Loeb is interested in the end of the world. More specifically, he's interested in the idea that humanity's romance with technology has the species and the planet on a course that may lead to catastrophe. And I wanted to tease this apart a bit and, kind of talk about, kind of like your approach and interest and maybe anxieties about the world. I don't know. But I wanted to talk to you. I want to talk to you in a second about the kind of sad story about what's happened with the term doomer over the last couple years, unfortunately. But I guess I've always thought of you as a kind of a do-me guy and not necessarily a doomer guy. So, I mean, how'd you get interested in this stuff and, where's it come from in life? And yeah.
So I do feel like I have to just own up to it at the front that part of that is a little bit of a joke.
Yeah.
Something that I used to always say when I was still working on my PhD is that everybody in the department would refer to me as Mr. Doom, but then once I finished my PhD, I would officially be Dr. Doom. And I do have some students who refer to me as Dr. Doom. I hope that they mean it as a term of endearment, but I think that this gets a little bit to what you were saying a moment ago about just the term doomer. Where part of it is, if you're interested in disasters, catastrophes, things going wrong, if this is something you focus on to any extent, regardless of how sunny your personal disposition may be, you almost inevitably find yourself being typecast as kind of a doom and gloom, end of the world type person. You know, sometimes I'll introduce what I work on by saying that I work on disasters and doomsaying and other things that don't get me invited to a lot of parties.
Right.
But in terms of the interest in it, in terms of what drives it, I find that there's so often a lot of focus in the history of technology and in broader discussions of technology on these kind of narratives of improvement, these hopeful narratives, this general technological optimism, technological utopianism. And I have just found it really interesting to look at the flip side of that. The warnings, the warnings that are heeded, the warnings that are ignored, the voices of critics, whether those are heeded or ignored, and also a recognition of not just when the hype doesn't pan out, but when things fail, when things break down, when things go wrong. And so I find that alongside these kind of heroic narratives around technology and technologists, there is also this flip side of stories of warnings, stories of anxieties, stories that are often of predictions of doom. And I think that it's important to have a serious historical engagement with that side of things alongside the engagement with the more hopeful and optimistic side. I think that as all kinds of different things happen in the technological world, when something goes wrong, there's this tendency to say, nobody could have seen this coming. Nobody warned us. Nobody knew. And one of the things that I'm really interested in exploring in my work is, okay, but who are the people who did see it coming? What did they say? What were the warnings? And I recognize that this might be a little bit of a tangent, so my apologies, but I feel like...
No, there's no tangents here, man. It's all good.
I am nothing but tangents, I'm afraid. But I feel like we're seeing some of this in the present moment around the AI discussions, where there has been this kind of sudden rediscovery of the critic Joseph Weizenbaum, who was talking about AI, warning about AI. You know, his book comes out in the 70s. And while some of his stuff is obviously dated, there's also so much that seems very prescient. And there's this moment of, oh, wait, somebody did see this coming. Somebody did warn about this. And I think that beyond that specific example, when we're talking about the present of technology and we're talking about things that are going wrong in it, can be really useful to engage with, okay, what were those former warnings? What were moments when things went wrong before? Yeah. I mean, I think that this is something that your work speaks to as well. Like, what have the past hype cycles looked like? How many times have we been told that this new technology is going to save the world and make us dinner and make us all, you know, perfect, satisfied human beings? And then the reality is not that.
Totally. Yeah, it's funny, man. I identify so much with, you know, like what you've been saying, especially like if you write about these things, like the assumptions people make about your own like attitudes. So like it's funny because it's like, I think people who feel like they're on the side of me and Andy on some topics, they assume that we're kind of like against technological change in ways that we often just aren't, but that somehow they read this into our work. And so it's just funny kind of like how, you know, we get typed as scholars, you know, kind of regardless of, you know, what's actually driving our work and what we're up to. going back to the Weizenbaum thing, I thought that was very interesting. So like, because I've been writing a lot about, you know, like not just like positive hype, but what I call criti-hype, or like, you know, kind of apocalyptic visions of technological change, or dystopian ones. Like, what do you find, like, if we go back to Weizenbaum, like, what do you find insightful about his work, or prescient, as you put it?
So I think that some of the things that are prescient about his work are his engagement with the hype that is taking place around himself. Just being very engaged with what other people were saying in his time, which is also a reminder of past predictions that were being made. Yeah. I think that the moral engagement with some of these topics in his work is very important. I mean, there's so much attention right now, whether it's to ethical AI or responsible AI or whatever the other term is. And he's there kind of at the outset saying, like, okay, we need to be focused on what people are doing here. And looking at him, one of the things that he is engaging with, and I mean, you can critique him about this, and you can also use him to critique others, is just focusing on, okay, what are the hopes and fears that people are projecting onto their technologies? And I really do think it's important to emphasize hopes and fears. That people are, and I think you kind of said this yourself a moment ago, like on the one hand, people are projecting kind of these utopian visions onto technology. And at the same time, people are projecting kind of apocalyptic visions onto technology. And I think that one of the dangers here, and I mean, lots of other people talk about this stuff as well, is that when you have this kind of juxtaposition with like the utopia and the dystopia as like the poles that are getting all of the attention, then you're missing out on all of the less utopian, but still significant ways that something could potentially improve lives. Yeah. And then you also miss out on all of the less apocalyptic, but still serious harms and risks. You know, it doesn't need to be a Terminator style end of civilization for something to still have serious impacts and risks.
Yep. I mean, it's been fascinating watching different communities around AI and technology, STS folks, people more involved in CS, try to strike this balance recently, you know, about this very thing. And I think what you just said is kind of like, you know, there's been a number of people, whether it's Emily Bender, or other folks kind of trying to strike that balance, saying like, you know, the apocalyptic visions of AI kind of distract us from like the actual kind of mundane harms these things could cause. So one thing, you know, you do, while you were working on your dissertation, you were also in kind of public ways reading and writing about a number of technology critics and kind of like mid-20th century folks. So I want to talk about Lewis Mumford especially, but you were writing about a lot of people like German, kind of Frankfurt School-esque people, if I remember correctly, and a number of people. So yeah, I mean, let's talk a bit about that kind of side of your project, and we can go into Mumford especially, but yeah, let's just tell us a bit about that.
Sure. So one of the things, going back to what I said before, is I'm interested in the past warnings. I'm interested in the past critics. Oh gosh, I don't want to get myself in trouble for saying this, but I feel like so much of the contemporary technology criticism, especially kind of popular and sometimes the more journalistic stuff, I think that sometimes there's a tendency to forget that the 20th century happened, and to forget that there were people issuing warnings, issuing critiques, people saying, you know, this isn't going to work out the way that we think it is. This isn't going to work out the way that you hope it is. That from the beginning of, you know, anything that you could even vaguely refer to as the computer era, there are people who are saying these machines are primarily just going to centralize more wealth and power in the hands of the people who already have the wealth and power. And those are voices that were often kind of like shut down, ignored amidst the earlier excitement, hype, enthusiasm around computing. And some of those people get rediscovered to varying extents. Some of those people remain kind of ignored. But in terms of my work, even before I was, specifically working on Y2K, I was really looking at the work of people like Lewis Mumford, Jacques Ellul, Evan Illich, Günther Anders, Hans Jonas, Ursula Franklin, figures who were really grappling with and talking about the risks inherent in technology, the risks inherent in technological systems. Many of them were very attuned from kind of an early moment to what computers would do, towards the risks entailed in what happens when everything becomes so reliant on computer systems. And I think that what I find particularly interesting about a lot of these figures is how they combine a really rigorous kind of consideration of the technologies with also a pretty uncompromising moral and ethical vision, which at times can make them, a little pedantic. At times it can make them a little frustrating to deal with. At times the moralizing of it can make you, it can certainly turn people off. With several of these thinkers, Ellul, for instance, their religious faith is also a very, very significant part of their critique, which is definitely something that can also push some people away from their criticisms. But I've just always really been fascinated by, in some ways, kind of the ruthlessness of their critiques. And I think that for some of them, maybe they were able to enjoy that because they were, I don't want to say that they were on the fringes of society, but maybe they were on the fringes of academia. They were public they were public intellectuals in a time when being a public intellectual still kind of meant something a little bit more in terms of the iconoclastic position that you were able to maintain. And I think that there are some things that they were able to see and that they were able to call that really, they nail things down in some ways and make some really, really powerful points. I think that, and this is something that I have written about previously. I wrote about it in the sadly now defunct Real Life magazine. But there's a concept that Lewis Mumford talks about in one of his final big works, The Pentagon of Power, where he talks about this idea of what he calls megatechnic bribery. And he's talking about the way that people are offered a share in the benefits of kind of mass production and mass produced technological society, because that gets them to be willing to accept all of the other bad stuff. And I just remember the very first time I was reading him and the first time I came across that concept, which is, quite a long time ago when I was first reading it. And it just seemed like he kind of nailed it in some ways. And I especially appreciated that, he formulated the idea as a bribe. That it's not just, technology improves all of our lives and that's great and that's wonderful. But this sense that the ways in which you all get a little bit of a benefit out of it is in order to make you not pay attention to those other sides. And when he's talking about the megatechnic bribe, and he's talking about this in the early 70s, the thing that he's talking about as what is going to be what will make this whole thing possible is the centralized computer.
What benefits does he think computing is going to give us that we won't want to give up? What is his vision there?
So it's kind of the world of plenty, the world of, he isn't specifically talking about streaming platforms or anything, but it's this idea of mass produced plenty, of having access to all of the different things that you might want, the share in the plenitude that's available. And I mean, so this concept is in turn part of his concept of the mega machine, which is a little bit of a deterministic concept of kind of the way that all of the various technologies work together in line with kind of the broader power system. And it's kind of this overwhelming, domineering force. But he's also talking about, and again, he's talking about this in the 60s and 70s, that the computer is going to be the thing that is going to make this system
that's fascinating.
Possible. And I mean, then to just relate it back to Weizenbaum, I mean, Weizenbaum and Mumford are friends. And they are in correspondence with each other. And a lot of the ideas that Weizenbaum is kind of talking about in terms of the computer in society, like they clearly show the influence of Mumford's talk about computers, Mumford's talk about how they fit into the larger society as well.
Right. What's interesting to me about this, and I wonder what your take on this is I see this a lot in people writing in the 70s and 70s especially. Like we can also talk about Langdon Winter, the kind of technology critic in early STS work. But I'm just lumping him in here. I mean, it strikes me that I'll have to go back to the Mumford thing and look at it and think about it. But it strikes me that a lot of people, even the critics, were very optimistic about the ways computers were going to contribute to economic abundance that actually didn't pan out, right? Because like productivity growth has been, with the exception of the 90s, been really slow since about 1970. And so like this has been a mystery, is like why we don't have more abundance for computers. But it seems like they were that was definitely the moment where that was the assumption, even amongst the kind of like hardest core critics. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I definitely see what you're saying. I think that like in some terms, some of them buy into it more than others. I think that some of them are so skeptical of the claims about these technological systems that they're also a little bit wary of the claim that there is going to be this much growth or productivity or
abundance or whatever.
That they're very skeptical of the idea that these technologies are going to be able to live up to their demands. There's also some of them seem to have not really seen the personal computer coming quite as much, and not seen like some of that side of things. So I'm thinking again about Mumford in this period, and he's pretty skeptical of the counterculture and the things that the counterculture will do and will achieve. But he also doesn't seem to be paying particularly much attention to the counterculture's interest with computers.
Right. So he's projecting, this is still a time when you have, I don't know, mini computers or like centralized computer systems in corporations, and they're projecting that forward and not seeing like, I
mean, they're projecting that forward, but as he's talking about computers and the Pentagon of Power, Mumford is also talking about them being a force that intrudes onto every waking moment of a person's life. So there's clearly a sense that even if he, at his time, is thinking of computers as these massive things that take up an entire floor in a building, he also is seeing them as things that are going to encroach more and more into everyday life for people. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing it right now, but he has this line about how the computer will make it so that no moment of a person's life, perhaps not even their dreams, will escape the eye of, he calls it the reinstated sun god in the form of the central computer.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, man, I really want to revisit this stuff now. How fascinating.
And I wrote about this, Mumford. I wrote about some of Mumford's stuff on computers in a Boundary 2 special issue online from quite a few years ago on the digital turn from the sadly departed David Columbia, who edited that.
Oh, yeah. Rest in peace, Columbia. Totally. Well, cool, man. I'll definitely link to that, too. There's a couple more things I want to play with before we like hop into your dissertation and research. Sure. So the other thing is like pulling apart the second part of that, this part of the second sentence in your bio is interested in the idea that humanity's romance with technology may lead to catastrophe. I wonder where like you kind of, because you're interested in the idea and you're writing about the history of idea, and I just wonder, like, kind of where you're at with that idea these days, because I think that something's changing in my soul about this this idea, and and so I'm still puzzling through it. But recently I've been thinking a lot about like the suffering and problems we see in places like Flint, Michigan, West Virginia, the south side of Chicago, and my hometown of Joliet, Illinois, which is kind of a blown out post-industrial place. And wondering, like, because like there's a long history of like focusing on solutionism and the technological fix, and that kind of like the focusing on the ideology of technology as like a problem in society, in STS and the history of technology. And I look at these places and I'm like, how much is like the idea, the worship of technology actually contributing to the problems of these people today?
Yeah.
And then I end up seeing it like probably not very much, and then like I don't know. And so like to the degree that like the kind of STS world is still very focused on debunking solutionism. I mean, there's books just out on this in the last couple of years. I'm just like, I don't know if we're like hitting the heart of like what is like material suffering, because these are technological problems, right? These are real material suffering, but I'm not sure how much the ideology of technology is contributing. So I just wonder like how, I don't know, with putting that out there, I mean, what do you think, man? And I'll play with it another way in a second, but take a shot at that.
So the first thing that I just want to say in response is that this is probably not going to be my best answer.
That's fine.
And one thing I'll also add here is that I think that a lot of my thinking in this area is influenced less specifically by STS and history of technology, and is more influenced by my work within the disaster studies field and the history of disasters.
Cool.
A lot of which often touches on questions of resilience. And I also think that a lot of the work on disaster studies and work on the history of disasters, I think that a lot of that work does a really, really good job of looking at the aftermath of the disaster. So if in the way that disasters often get talked about in public, there is, the calamitous event, which draws all of the attention. And then once the news cameras pack up and move on, at least in kind of the public narrative, there's also an assumption that like, and it's done and it's over. And work in disaster studies, a lot of it does a really, really excellent job of showing the persistence of the disaster, showing the continued legacies of destruction, showing the long-term consequences of, maybe there really was the big calamitous event, but just because the hurricane blows out to sea, just because the polluting plant eventually gets shut down, those long-term consequences are really, really there. And in terms of some of the communities that you referred to before, I think that their present situations, they don't seem to me to be a sign of the current moment of technological utopianism, but they're kind of the victims of past moments of technological utopianism that did not pan out.
Yep, totally.
And
I agree with that.
And, I know that in some bodies of scholarship, they use the term like sacrifice zones. In disaster studies, you often see, the term slow disaster being used to apply to these things. And I know that there are many people within disaster studies who really talk about how poverty is the main disaster that underlies so many others. And I think that in looking at some of these communities, and I do just want to be very clear that I'm not an expert in any of them, nor am I claiming to be, it seems like they are then victimized again as the broader society and political leaders move on with their new forms of kind of techno-utopian thinking, which they say are going to then go back and retroactively save these people, save their communities, revitalize their industry and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, they are tragic evidence that past waves of, technological utopianism did not deliver what was promised. And then they're kind of left in a stasis. I mean, not a stasis because things are degrading further as the society kind of moves on to the next hope, which is then promised is going to come back and save them. I mean, I think that the moment of telling coal miners to learn to code has kind of passed us by. And I mean, I don't know how seriously, well, I mean, some people did take that pretty seriously, including some elected officials. But I feel like at this moment, the learn to code mantra has kind of died out a little bit. And it seems like now there's almost a moment of, we just have to wait until AI saves us all. We're not sure.
I hope not.
We're not sure how AI is going to save us all.
Yeah.
But it seems now like so much hope is just getting vested in AI, which is like a beautiful term in which to invest all of your hopes, because AI, if you get a room of 10 experts together and ask them exactly what they mean when they use the term AI, those 10 people will probably give you 20 different definitions.
Yep. Yep. The other example I was thinking along these lines too, and I wanted you to take on this. So if we think about climate change, which is, a core kind of issue for me, I mean, it struck me that I was part of this research group at Carnegie Mellon when I was a grad student that was looking at climate policy. And these folks were not reading STS, I think. I mean, they had some familiarity, but they really thought they would talk about magic bullet technologies as like one problem, that people were like waiting for something to come over the horizon that were going to like save our asses. And they were very clear that that was not going to happen and we needed to get moving. But then on the other hand, we have I think significant climate policy, and we see this around the climate justice stuff, that recognizes that significant climate policy would boost prices, it would raise prices probably. I mean, it would be inflationary, right? And, I think we see it in the politics of Biden. Remember when gas prices went up a couple summers ago? And Biden, Mr. Environmentalist Biden, I mean, that's a joke right there. But, he's, he was like, I'll do everything possible to get gas prices down, And it's well, significant climate policy would raise energy prices, I think. And so then there's kind of magic bullet technologies and solutionism as one problem on the one hand, and the balance that has with we live in a democracy where people hate to see prices go up.
Yep.
And so things become politically unfeasible just because people will not accept what, amounts to something like a tax. And so that's kind of where I keep coming back to the solutionism stuff. I'm I can see clear cases where it's an issue, actually. That's not a problem for me at all. But then I wonder about the balance with things we live in democracies, and democracies are kind of shitty because people don't want to pay for, their the costs they create on society. Yeah, I don't know. So there's another rant. What what do you think?
Just to kind of throw something out there to tie it back a little bit to an earlier point. One thing that I do, again, find interesting about looking at the history of some of these ideas is that if you look at George Perkins Marsh and Eugene Husserl in the, they're writing in the middle of the 19th century, and they aren't talking about climate change in the way that we're talking about it now, but they are kind of talking about climate change in terms of talking about the ways that we are technologically engaging with the planet are going to have long-term consequences that we are eventually going to have to deal with. But in terms of the parallel that you just drew out, I mean, this is a puzzling thing. Like, and I don't have the easiest answer for it. I mean, I personally would consider myself to be somebody who is very, very concerned about climate change. And at the same time, like, I am also somebody who, like, when the prices of all of my groceries go up, I'm like, oh man, the prices of all of my groceries go up. And like, you know, like, I think that's true of a lot of people who, on one hand, do have some level of, you know, if I needed to pay higher prices because it would deal with climate change, like, that is something that I should be willing to do, while at the same time being like, if that happens, like, my already stretched budget gets stretched even further. And I mean, here we're also then pushing a little bit into, you know, is this just a way of pushing the costs of climate change and other issues on individual consumers while the oil companies are still, you know, making billions of dollars. But I think that some of what you just pointed to in terms of like the parallels here of, you know, silver bullet solutions, we don't believe in them on the one hand, versus, you know, the complex realities of people would not be happy if you tried to do some of this stuff. And the thing is, I think that the complexity of introducing the things that we already know we could do that would make a difference then winds up making people put more hope back into the silver bullet. You know, we don't need to do anything now, because just give it 6 months and AI will figure it out. And I feel like in recent months, you keep seeing articles that talk about the serious environmental costs of AI. You know, the amount of water these facilities consume, the energy that is required for all of these large language models. And when you bring up those concerns, you usually get a response from somebody in the AI space who's like, yes, but AI will figure that out. Just like give it a bit more time. And I think that the hope that there is going to be, you know, that technological solution that magically arrives and saves us just in the nick of time is, I think that it gets more popular in moments when people kind of lose a little bit of their faith in the democratic small d side of things. And one of the things that I've been thinking about along these lines a lot lately is when people talk about technological optimism and technological pessimism.
Or doomerism. That's where I was going next with you.
And I mean, one of the things that I just keep coming back to with technological optimism and technological pessimism, and I was thinking about this a lot because I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, but is it Mark Andreessen who just wrote that Techno-Optimist Manifesto?
Oh, God, Jesus.
Yeah.
You had to remind me.
Sorry. But I mean, one of the things that just strikes me about so many of the conversations around this stuff is that a lot of the people who describe themselves as technological optimists are extremely pessimistic about human beings, are extremely pessimistic about people, about small d democracy, about institutions. And on the flip side, I think that you often find that some of the people who are potentially technologically pessimistic are very optimistic about people. You know, they maintain a lot of hope and faith in the ability of people. And I definitely think that that's true of many of those 20th century, you know, critics of technology who we were discussing earlier. Mumford was painfully aware of the fact that people called him a prophet of doom and saw him in that way. And he was always trying to emphasize that he saw tremendous potential and hope in people and in human beings' creativity and their ability to use these tools wisely and appropriately and in a way that kept the human being instead of the technology at the center of it.
Yeah.
And I think that that's kind of one of the issues there. You know, when somebody says that they're a technological optimist or a technological pessimist, I'm less interested in how you feel about technology. Tell me how you feel about people.
Yep. And government and lots of other things. Yeah, exactly. Just briefly, I mean, this is connected to what we were just saying, but I was thinking about, I was thinking about chatting with you. I was thinking about just the sad story of what's happened with the term doomer over the last year or two. I mean, on the one hand, like, I've written a lot about, criti-hype and like the ways that technology criticism often kind of is parasitic on hype around technology. And I kind of get a kick out of this thing called the Pessimist Archive, which is this. I hate its politics because it was like a Koch-funded project originally, and it's kind of pro-entrepreneurship and pro-innovation in ways that I'm definitely not. But it is kind of a fun repository of just like all of these amazing fantasies about how technology X or Y was going to ruin society. Like the Walkman is a hilarious example of like the Walkman was going to lead to the downfall of society, according to like some pieces back in the day. But on the other hand, I feel like what's happened to the term doomer is that it's become kind of a cudgel. Yeah. That I think the most unhelpful thing is it just lumps lots of different critics who are actually pretty different from each other.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't know. I just wonder if you've been observing this too and your thoughts on what's happened to the doomer term.
Yeah, so I'm always interested in any term which is building off of doom. I've been fascinated by the term doom scrolling. Yeah, and I've written about that, and I've written about the doomer idea too. And the thing that I keep coming back to when it comes to the idea of doomer is that I really feel like the term doomer, like, it says more about the person accusing somebody else of being a doomer than the actual person being called that. And I feel like a lot of the times,
I think that's right.
A lot of the times it feels like a doomer is anybody who is 10% more pessimistic than you are. Mm-hmm. And this is also one of those terms where the way that it gets used in so many different circles kind of increases, in some ways, the uselessness of the term. Like, within climate discourse, like doomer is a term that gets kind of applied to anybody who is a little bit more pessimistic than, certain well-regarded like public voices on climate change. And if you pay attention to climate change discourse, like, people within there are like, they routinely are calling other people doomers. It's like a term that is always like, you are more pessimistic than I am. You are, you're encouraging hopelessness. Then on the flip side, we could look at the term doomer as it gets applied in the pandemic related discourse, where to a large extent, if you are somebody who recognizes that there is still a pandemic going on and you are still taking any sorts of precautions, people will label you a doomer. And then if you look at something as regards to AI, for instance, like, doomer winds up being the term that gets used to describe some of the people who like are convinced that AI is about to kill us all. And in all of these cases, I think that the term doomer prevents us from actually listening to what those people are saying, which is not to say that those people aren't sometimes saying things that are weird and problematic and all of that stuff. I'm not trying to give them carte blanche, but if you, and I mean, you said this yourself a moment ago, if you look at the people who get lumped together under the term doomer, a lot of the times it's like, these people don't actually have much in common. There isn't much going on. And then, of course, at the same time, as so often happens with these things, you then start to see people who take that label as like a badge of honor.
Yeah, right.
You know, like, and I mean, this is a whole other side topic that I'm sure we could talk about at length. But in some ways, I feel like doomer has become like comparable to the term Luddite, where people like say like, fine, if you're going to call me a Luddite, then I am a Luddite. I am going to embrace. I am going to embrace this term as an identity. And then you see a similar thing sometimes happening with doomers, where people are like, no, like, yeah, if you're going to call me a doomer for this, then I am a doomer. And some people kind of embrace it. And in both of these cases, I think that term and those terms wind up distracting us a little bit from, okay, what do these people actually think? What do these people actually believe? Yeah. How does it compare to what is, you know, mainstream acceptable discourse potentially? And especially in terms of some of the AI doomer stuff, like, I don't know how credible I find it. Like, it seems to me that some of the people who are talking about AI and how it's going to kill us all are really just trying to build up the hype about AI capabilities.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's been amazing how OpenAI has, like, I mean, Altman and these characters have gotten in on, and Musk have gotten in on the Doom game, you know, because I think, exactly. It's been amazing. It might be like an amazing moment just to see like how business leaders have like done crit hype, as I would describe it, like as a way to like build the hype. I mean, it's become kind of like weaponized in that way,
and it's a good way to get government attention, and it's a good way to position yourself as kind of the stewards of this, the people who are you know, the only people who are smart enough to manage this and contain this and handle this. And I mean, getting back to what we were saying before, at least when it comes to something like AI, like so much of the focus on the apocalyptic scenarios distracts from the more quotidian harms that are taking place in like daily life. I think that for the average person, the AI danger is not a Terminator-like extinction event. It's that an AI algorithm is going to flag your loan application, or AI is going to result in weird things happening on your credit card statement that get your account closed, or AI is going to lead to some member of your family falling for a really terrible scam, you know, and these are the types of AI harms that are happening right now. These are not fictional things that we need to make up, but they do not get the same type of attention as like the Terminator scenario. I mean, it's, I think in some ways we are seeing that our technological dystopia is much closer to kind of the banal dystopia of Black Mirror than it is to like Terminator or I mean, not Terminator, but like even like 1984 or anything like that. And I mean, I know that this is probably like a bit of like a cultural tangent, but I was so fascinated by the fact that the latest season of Black Mirror had zero cultural impact. Like, people weren't talking about it. It seemed like people weren't really watching it. And it just seemed like we have finally, as a society, hit this moment where, like, we get it, Black Mirror. Like, like, you,
the work go ahead. No. You go for it. Finish.
I mean, just you no longer need to convince us that the real dystopia is like the everyday engagement,
shitty reality we live in. The sci-fi work I always point to these days is William Gibson's The Peripheral, which
Jackpot.
Is a kind of like, it doesn't really work. I mean, the ending kind of sucks, but I think just like it has kind of two timelines, like a near future and the farther future. And the near future is like people living in in trailer parks and cooking meth and flying drones is a side hustle. And I'm like, that's a pretty prescient take on the near future of technology. So finally, I mean, I'm glad I did this. I wanted to give people kind of a sense of your larger project and thinking about this stuff before, and just kind of play with some themes and chat some stuff out with you before we talked about Y2K.
Sure.
I remember like the members of the history of technology community we're both a part of were really excited about you taking on this topic because everyone knew someone how to do it. So finally you came along and did it for us. So how did you get into it as a topic? Place it in this larger discussion we've been having and why you decided to focus on Y2K.
So I will be honest, and I will recognize that in my honesty, I might be hurting my reputation a little bit. But I was looking for a good real world example to examine these topics, to look at these themes, and kind of trying to find an event where there really was this really big kind of apocalyptic anxieties around technology. Yeah. And when I really first started working on Y2K, I was really initially kind of focused on the most doomsday-y side of things. I was aware of the realities of the computing problem, the programming issue that underlies Y2K. I was aware of, some of the government side of stuff. But then once I started working on it in any depth, I was entertained is the wrong word for it. I was simultaneously kind of, pulled in and disgusted by like all of the survival guides and like the apocalyptic material that I was collecting on it.
Preppers and stuff.
Yeah. But then as I started going deeper and deeper, like I really found the technical side of it to be fascinating in terms of the ways that the IT community was thinking about it. And I especially found the government side of it really, really interesting. I have lost more of my life to reading Y2K government hearings than I would like to admit.
Dude, the chapter's really good, though. Yeah, thank you for doing the work.
Well, oh, God. But, like, one of the things that just, like, again and again, as I was reading all of these hearings that I was just, like, coming up against was, like, all of these government officials, not just elected officials, but the various people who are coming before government committees and testifying, there's really kind of this revelation in these hearings of like, wait, how reliant are we on these systems? What happens if these computers stop working? You mean that in order for our lights to stay on, the computers have to stay on, and there's something wrong with the computers? It's just, and I started to see this kind of everywhere in the Y2K stuff that I was working on. And this became the thing about Y2K that really drives my project now and really drives my own interest, is that I think that there is the way that Y2K is remembered now as this kind of silly techno panic where people were stocking up on canned goods and the world was going to end, and then bupkis.
Yeah.
And I'll get back to the bupkis in a moment. But the other thing, the thing that really comes through to me, and the thing that I've really been fascinated to find in so much of my work on this, is that Y2K is also this moment where, especially in the United States, which is really what my work has focused on, it was this moment that forced people to reckon with how reliant society had become on these opaque technological systems, forced them to realize just how integral these systems were to everything continuing to work around them. And it's this moment, this is in the midst of all of like the new economy hype around computers and the digital and all of that. And it's this moment where people are going, hey, maybe we should slow down. Maybe we need to rethink this. Maybe more computers aren't going to be the solution to the problem because look at this mess.
Yeah.
And then when nothing much goes wrong, this kind of just gets forgotten. And it kind of just becomes a case of, oh, if there are these sorts of problems, it's okay. We'll just be able to deal with them. IT will be able to take care of it. And then, I mean, just to return back to kind of the Bupkis moment, like, I think that one of the other big problems around Y2K is that the elevation of the most apocalyptic voices, including by a lot of media outlets that should have known better, meant that a lot of people thought that, the world was going to end, that planes were going to fall out of the sky.
Yeah.
But if you actually are looking at what is in the government reports and what the technical experts and the people who really know, what they're saying in 1998 and 1999 is, there might be some bumps in the road. There might be some smallish problems, but like, we've got this taken care of. Like, nothing that bad is going to happen. And then a lot of stuff did go wrong. There were a lot of Y2K related problems. If you look at the final report that was issued by the Senate Special Committee on the Year 2000 problem, it has a lengthy appendix listing Y2K related errors. Now, to be clear, most of these errors and problems are of the bump in the road variety. Yeah. But that's what they were saying was going to happen. And then the other side of this is also, if you were working at a company on Y2K related issues in the 90s and that rollover happened and your company did encounter problems, but you and the rest of your IT team were able to get those issues fixed relatively quickly, why on earth would you tell people that you had problems?
So there's probably underreporting problems.
There is tremendous underreporting, and you see and hear this when you talk to people who did that work now. I mean, when the first time that I heard somebody from the IT sector say, oh yeah, I worked on Y2K, and that first week of the year 2000, all of our computers were haywire. I was like, oh, that's an amusing anecdote that I will file away in the back of my mind. But after you hear some version of that story over and over and over again, you start to wonder if, like, maybe there's a little bit more to that. And also, if you look at what people in the IT sector, if you were looking at what the government people were saying in the early months of the year 2000, like, they were very aware of this, that like a huge number of the problems that were happening were going underreported because, again, why would you risk your business's reputation by admitting that you had problems?
Yeah, and I think the other side of it, which you touch on too, is in your dissertation and other places, is that the Bupkis response to the whole thing is just really underestimates how much fucking work people did in the 90s. Like my uncle Lon, my dad's brother, that was his business in the 90s, was just doing Y2K fixes professionally. Wow. He was one of these guys. So if you ever want to talk to yet another Y2K consultant,
I will follow up with you on that.
Yeah. So I mean, like there were a lot of people. That was what they were doing. Yeah. And so it's like, sure, it's just I really liked the subtitle to your real life piece, rest in peace, real life, but it's the subtitle was "The Non-Apocalypse of Y2K Obscures the Lessons It Has for the Present." And it's things like, it's just one of these cases where the pop story, the pop version of like how it didn't, turn into the big problem people predicted just misses so much, both what happened in the 90s and what, to your point, which is really interesting, what was happening in the first couple months of 2000 that we just don't know about.
Yeah, there is my apologies, I don't have it right in front of me right now, but there was a Wired magazine article from the 90s that talked about how 1998 And that was in the New York Times in 1988. And I mean, Social Security Administration, for instance, is already working on fixing Y2K related problems in the 1980s. The time frame of how different groups are working on Y2K, the time frame of how different groups are assessing Y2K are really, really varied. So there is this moment in the earlier 90s where there is some very, very heightened concern in the IT sector. But by the time that the public really starts like paying attention to this, the IT sector is like, we still have work to do. We aren't done, but we are doing the work and we are going to get it done. But I mean, to bring it back to my earlier point, I think that this gets at the way that Y2K really didn't mean the same thing to everyone. You know, I think that for a lot of IT workers, it was like, okay, this is this annoying technical problem that we're going to have to spend a lot of time and devote a lot of resources to fixing. But then I think on the public side of it, it was more a matter of, do you realize that your power, your banks, all of the things that make your modern life possible are reliant on computers? And did you know those computers might fail? And I mean, the things the things that people are reacting to there, the things that people are focusing on there are, you know, they're kind of the same thing, but they're also distinct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you bring up a number of things that I wanted to talk to you about. So, the first is like, I really love the structure of your dissertation, which you just aptly describe as a kind of Rashomon style analysis, referring to this famous Japanese novella, I feel like is the length that kind of like gets at like these different, how an event can look through different perspectives. And so you structure the thing by looking at these different communities and how they're perceiving it over time and how that's different. And I really love that. I just wonder, are you keeping that? I mean, is that you know, like the book version of this? Or is
the book version? Yeah. So I do not have enough words of possible thanks that I could express to you for the fact that you seem to have read some, or at least part of the dissertation. Thank you immensely. The dissertation is too long for a book. I certainly recognize that. I definitely want to keep some of that focus on the different perspectives, because I think that I've also read some stuff by people who might have been called, quote unquote, conspiratorial. And like, what they're talking about is like setting up a food bank at their church.
Yeah.
And it's like, we need to be able to recognize that, that there's a difference here between the people who genuinely were saying, buy guns, buy gold, head for the hinterlands. And the people who really were like grifting, you know, the people who really were like using this as an opportunity to like sell survival supplies to people who they were playing a role in frightening.
Yeah.
But then like, there are also a lot of people who are like, really like, okay, this is going to be a problem that is potentially going to overwhelm the government. So the only thing we can do is work together and make our own communities prepared for it. And lumping all of that together gets really weird. And it also kind of points at some of the issues that were taking place within the 90s of just, I think that there was a lot more uncertainty about what was going to happen than people like to admit in retrospect. And if you look at a lot of the government reports, and these are the official things that are coming out with, you know, the stamp of the Clinton administration on them. And they aren't telling people, you've got nothing to worry about. They also aren't telling people, don't prepare for the end of the world. But they're saying, look, this could have some problems. You should prepare for it the same way that you prepare for any other kind of disaster, whether that's a blizzard or a hurricane. You know, it's just, it's not a bad idea for you to have some extra water, some extra blankets, a flashlight, like some of that stuff. It's just like, that's just generic, decent
preparedness.
Yeah, that's just basic advice. And paying attention to some of these gaps can be really interesting. I mean, it's one of the things that's in one of the last chapters in the dissertation, and I'm currently working on turning it into a journal article, is there was this organization called the Center for Y2K in Society.
Yes.
And they were doing a lot of work to coordinate amongst nonprofits. And one of the things that they did that I found really fascinating is that they were issuing these community report cards where they were asking people, and they were also engaging directly with the local governments, to talk about what is the level of preparedness? You know, how ready is your community for, you know, whatever could happen?
Something going wrong, yeah.
And digging through the archival records of this organization, which I was able to do because they're at the Charles Babbage Institute at the University of Minnesota, I just kept coming across all of these, like, I mean, hilarious as a historian and not actually hilarious, but like these very strongly worded letters on official, like, city letterhead being like, you said on your website that our city has a C in terms of preparedness. How dare you? You need to take this down immediately. This is going to cause panic. But one of the things that this points to in this material is just that, like, there was a real gap between what people thought the level of readiness was and what the government thought the level of readiness was. And in that kind of gap between them, that's a real space where, like, paranoia can flourish.
Yeah.
And I mean, then I recognize that I'm rambling, but this is another fun point to just, like, stick in here. One of the things that's also interesting about Y2K is that there's a lot of concern about how the internet is spreading misinformation.
Oh, fascinating.
There is and you see this in a lot of the IT community conversations about this. And you see this in a lot of the government hearings where there is this real moment of, like, people are lying about this on the internet? People are allowed to do that? You mean people would just, I mean, I feel like it's a comic strip or a meme that often circulates of, like, do you mean somebody would go on the internet and lie? Who would do that? But, like, there is this real concern, especially from kind of the government side of things, that like they do not have control of the narrative, that they do not have control of the information, that people have these Y2K websites with all kinds of bizarro claims on them. And that stuff is reaching more people than some of these very sober government reports. And I'll just be honest, even if it doesn't reflect well on me, it was a lot more fun reading those weird websites than it was reading some of the government reports.
No, man, that's called historical research. That's reality. How were the websites still around? I mean, were they on the Wayback Machine, or like how'd you get them?
So anybody who ever says that the internet never forgets has never tried to do historical research on old websites. A lot of them aren't there. You can find bits and pieces. I have spent a lot of time on the Wayback Machine. And, you kind of get what you can get and you miss what isn't there. I mean, that being said, archival absences and archival silence, that happens with traditional institutional archives as well. In some places, I have been fortunate where various organizations were like printing out websites. And so some of like the paper copies of those appear in some of the archives that you can visit. Yeah. So I mentioned before, to just give one example, the Center for Y2K and Society. And in some of their boxes of material, they were like printing out all of the pages of their website. And honestly, if they hadn't done some of that, there are some things that, I wouldn't have known. And I mean, at the same time, as much as there are a lot of those internet related gaps, like a lot of the people who had the strange websites also quite nicely published a survival guide. So I was at least able to read the survival guide.
Yeah.
There was definitely a long stretch where, multiple times a week, a package would arrive at my home with a Y2K book in it.
Oh yeah, dude, you're on lists. There's no doubt about it. You're on several lists.
It has definitely permanently damaged all of my recommendations on any book related website.
So, the kind of last thing I want to ask you before we wrap up, it comes out in your community thing a bit. I've always thought this is an idea that's been around a long time, is that like Y2K became kind of a vector for traditions of millennialism that had been around in Western culture for a long time. Yeah, I just kind of wondered like how you looked at a lot of this shit and thought about this for a long time. So I just wonder where you end up on that idea. So I mean, the Christians, some Christians believe in the literal end of the world and the apocalypse, and these kinds of ideas are around in our culture and sometimes get projected onto technologies. It's, for sure. So yeah, I just wonder where you end up on that.
So I feel like I apologize if this answer isn't going to be a good or a clean one. I think that there is absolutely no doubt that there are some people who projected general millenarian biblical attitudes onto Y2K. And I have certainly read plenty of books from Bible prophecy people who were really, really seeing how Y2K lined up with, the end of the world. And I'll tell you this story because this gets to what I was saying before about favorite stories of weird stuff. So there's a book called Y2K equals 666 ? And and in this book, at one point, they're talking about how do we know that Y2K was foreseen in the Bible? And the answer that they come to is that if you look at the description of the Battle of Armageddon in the book of Revelation, what are the weapons being described? Well, they're, swords and chariots and stuff like that. And some people have said that the reason those are the technologies described there is because that was the technology, the weapons of war that were available at the time that the authors were writing.
Mm-hmm.
But in Y2K equals 666, they say, no. The reason they are using those weapons at the Battle of Armageddon is because Y2K has made it so all of the more advanced technologies of war no longer work.
Oh, man.
And I read that,
beautiful.
and it was just like, that was like a light bulb moment for me. I was like, I get it. And at the same time, the people who wrote Y2K equals 666, a decade earlier, they had put out a book called Computers and the Beast of Revelation.
This is a way thing that's going back like 666 and all this stuff. This has gone way back.
And the focus on, the mark of the beast as being something computer related.
Yeah.
However, I do really just want to emphasize that it's important not to flatten out the religious response to Y2K. Because there are some people in the Bible prophecy community who absolutely are saying that Y2K is the biblical end of days. I am not disputing that. That is absolutely the case. And I mean, you saw that in the dissertation as well.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are also people also in the Bible prophecy community who say, no, that isn't what this is. You are misreading things. You are projecting things incorrectly. And what you are doing by getting people hyped up about Y2K is ultimately going to lead people to turn away from religion, to turn away from faith. This is not as was biblically foreordained. And this is going to hurt religion. And then to bring it back to what I said before, there are also people who are saying from a religious perspective, hey, Y2K could cause some serious disruptions. We need to make sure that our communities are prepared. You need to use Y2K as an opportunity to set up a food pantry at your church, to make sure that you are coordinated so you can check in on your elderly parishioners in case they might lose power. And it's like, these are a range of different reactions. And I recognize that it's fun to talk about the most over the top doom and gloom stuff.
Sure.
But that really is kind of an apocalyptic fringe. And I feel like it's worth looking more holistically at the range of reactions. And then beyond that, in terms of some of the other millenarian stuff, I think that there are some people in the IT community who are using it as a joke and are very clearly using it as a joke. They'll throw around a term like doomsday, but they don't mean it.
They're not really.
Exactly. You can tell that they really don't mean it. And I mean, of course, there are some people from the IT world who did go a little bit off into the more oh, this is going to be really bad direction. And again, if you look at the government responses, they are very concerned about the apocalyptic tenor that this is taking on. But you aren't necessarily seeing those members of government, including the ones who are, Republican officials who do not like Bill Clinton or the Clinton administration, but who really are not pushing the apocalyptic narrative. I mean, one of the things that I found kind of consistently interesting in my work is the Senate Special Committee, really was a pretty convivial, bipartisan group.
Yeah.
You could
oh, the days. Yeah.
I mean, you could see a little bit more political sniping between parties in some of the House hearings and stuff. But Senator Dodd and Senator Bennett, who were the chairs of the Y2K committee, they really seemed to be getting along fine and doing this work in a bipartisan fashion. And within the House, I think there was especially between Congressman Horn and John Koskinen, who is Clinton's Y2K czar, there really is a little bit more kind of sparring and contention, and a little bit more, the Clinton administration isn't doing enough. And, when everything falls apart, it's going to be the Clinton administration's fault. But it also kind of seemed like Y2K was this problem that enough people agreed was a real problem that had a solution, and okay, do it.
Yeah. There's
actually
so go ahead.
I was just going to add, there's actually a little bit of a, depressing wrinkle in all of this that brings us a little bit back to what we were saying before, where in a lot of these hearings, I found people saying some version of Y2K is a real issue that we have to solve, unlike this climate change nonsense.
Oh, shit. Oh, the gloominess of that. Well, this has been fun, man. And I love how it turned into a kind of conversation about the dangers of lumping and the importance of realizing difference in these things that we try to squish into simple stories. Here's a seriously unfair question to ask for someone in their first year of being a professor who is working to revise a long dissertation into a book. But, I ask it because as we got into at the beginning of our conversation, you do have this kind of larger project that the Y2K thing's like a part of. So do you have a sense of where you're going next?
Sure. I don't think that that's an unfair question. I hope I have an okay answer for it. So the first thing is that I would be lying if I said anything other than keep working on Mumford. I mean, okay. I'm kind of perpetually working on Mumford and his connections to other people. One of the last things that I did before I left Philadelphia is I just spent lots of time going through his archival material and just taking 8 million photographs. And I've got several Mumford related things that I want to do. Cool. But that's also, that's just always in the background. The next project that I'm really thinking about and working on more fully, there are kind of two of them. One of them is just kind of a history of computer-related disasters.
Very good.
So one of the things about Y2K is that this is an example of, okay, they averted the disaster. The worst case scenario didn't happen. But one of the things that I came across while working on Y2K, and one of the things that I especially saw in some of my IT community-related work, was there's just this admission from a lot of the IT people that stuff breaks all the time. Stuff is constantly failing. And so I think that it could be interesting to do a little bit more of a look on,
Totally. We got to talk about this. You got to talk to my friend Bob Charette.
Yeah.
And there's so much.
And I think
totally.
I think that this definitely lines up with all of, the wonderful work you've done around the maintainers. But, I think that one of the flip sides of maintenance is sometimes it doesn't get done in time.
Yeah, sometimes,
and stuff goes wrong. The other thing that is a project that I'm in kind of the early stages of thinking through is I've become more and more interested in cybersecurity. And in particular, I think kind of the consumer-facing side of cybersecurity, because I think that cybersecurity is a really fascinating counter to some of the hype and excitement around computing. Because on the one hand, this computer is going to make your life better in a million ways, but you need to prepare yourself for scary hackers and viruses and all of this. And the way that cybersecurity simultaneously is encouraging the spread of computing, but is also framing the computer as a danger and a dangerous object that you need to use, but you also need to protect yourself from. So, Yeah. So
yeah, man.
So those are kind of the immediate things.
Both sound great and could be interwoven, I think, for sure. Well, Zachary, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for having me on, Lee. It's really an honor to be here.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at sts_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.